One word. That was all it took to stop an entire room. Liam Carter had not meant to say it out loud. He was exhausted, underpaid, and 2 seconds away from losing his temper into a Bluetooth earpiece when the word slipped. Baby. No one breathed. Every eye in the room moved to Aria Moreau. She did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply turned, looked directly at him, and said, "Say it again." Slower. The word hung in the air longer than it had any right to. Liam Carter stood near the far end of the room, with a service tray in one hand and a Bluetooth earpiece still warm in his ear, and he understood with the specific clarity that only comes right before something goes very wrong that every single person in that penthouse had just heard him. The catering agency had placed him here for the night, one of 4 servers working a private event on the 43rd floor of a midtown building where the elevator required a key card and the carpet probably cost more than his monthly rent. He had taken the job because he needed the cash, and he had been on the phone because his landlord had stopped being patient 3 weeks ago. The call had gone badly. He had meant to say, "Baby," to nobody. A reflex, a frustrated exhale directed at a voicemail, and instead he had said it directly into 400 square feet of absolute silence. He had not even realized the room had gone quiet until it was too late. Aria Moreau was standing 12 feet away from him. He knew who she was because the agency had briefed the staff before the doors opened. Names, faces, instructions on how not to make eye contact for too long or linger near certain guests. Aria Moreau, founder of Moreau Capital. 31 years old, one of the few people in this city who could make a room full of billionaires straighten their posture when she walked in. She was wearing a dark dress that looked simple until you looked longer and realized nothing about it was simple at all. She had been in the middle of a conversation with 2 men in suits when the word reached her, and now those men were staring at Liam the way people stare at a car that has just run a red light waiting for the impact. Aria was not staring. She was watching. There was a difference, and Liam felt it immediately. He opened his mouth to apologize, to explain, to say anything that would diffuse whatever had just been set in motion. But before he could form a single word, Aria took 1 step toward him, then another, and the room seemed to rearrange itself around her movement, the way crowds always do around people who are used to having space made for them. She stopped close enough that he could have lowered his voice and still been heard clearly. Her expression was not angry. It was something closer to amused, except colder the way someone looks when they find an unexpected variable in a problem they already thought they had solved. "Say it again," she said. Slower. Liam didn't say it again. He stood there holding a tray of untouched champagne flutes, while his career, his rent situation, and his general dignity all seemed to compress into a single point somewhere behind his sternum. He expected to be removed. He expected a phone call to the agency, his name crossed off a list, the quiet professional destruction that people like Aria Moreau could arrange without raising their voice. What he did not expect was for her to tilt her head slightly and say, "Come find me before you leave tonight," and then simply turn back to her conversation as though nothing had happened. The 2 men in suits looked at Liam. He looked at them. Nobody said anything. He finished the shift on autopilot, moving through the party with the careful blankness of someone who has decided that thinking too hard about what just happened will only make it worse. The event wound down after midnight, and he was helping break down the bar setup near the kitchen when one of Aria's staff, a sharp-looking woman named Nora Shields, who had spent the evening managing Aria's schedule with the efficiency of someone who had never once been caught off guard, appeared at his elbow and told him that Ms. Moreau would see him now. The study off the main room was quieter than the rest of the penthouse. Aria was sitting in a chair near the window with a glass of water and no phone in her hand, which somehow made her seem more formidable, not less. She looked at him for a long moment before she spoke. "You were on the phone," she said. It was not a question. Yes, Liam said. My landlord. I wasn't the word wasn't meant for you. I know that. She set the glass down on the table beside her. I want to know why you didn't run. He hadn't run because he needed the end of shift payment and couldn't afford to forfeit it. But standing in that room, under that particular quality of attention, he chose not to say that. Instead, he said, because running would have made it worse. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, not quite, but a recalibration, the kind that happens when someone files a piece of information in a folder they thought was already closed. I need something from you, Arya said. Not tonight, but starting this week. She explained it without making it sound like a request, because it wasn't. There was a series of events over the following month, dinners, a conference in Chicago, 2 gallery openings, where she required someone to fill a specific role beside her. Not security, not staff, something that looked more personal than that. Her actual personal life was a liability she had long since locked away, and the narrative around her had begun to attract a certain kind of attention that she wanted redirected. She needed someone who could stand next to her and be believable, someone who was unknown enough not to bring complications, and someone who, as she put it, had already demonstrated they could stay in a room when the pressure went up. She was offering to pay him. The figure she named was enough to cover 4 months of back rent and still leave a margin that Liam had not had in over 2 years. He stood there in the quiet of her study and understood exactly what kind of situation this was. It was the kind with fine print he couldn't fully read yet, inside a world he had no map for, beside a woman who collected leverage the way other people collected contacts. The rational answer was no. The rational answer was to thank her, walk out, and go back to the life that was at least legible, even if it was tight and exhausting and not going anywhere fast. But the money was real, and the look on her face was not the look of someone who made offers carelessly. All right, Liam said. I'm in. Arya did not smile. She simply picked up her glass again and said, Nora will send you the details in the morning. Don't be late to the first one. It was not a warm beginning, but it was a beginning. Nora sent the details at 6:47 in the morning. The message was a document 3 pages formatted with the precision of a legal brief. It covered the schedule for the next 4 weeks, a dress code breakdown, by event, type a short list of topics. Liam was not to bring up in public, and a single line at the bottom that read, if you are unsure how to respond to something, say nothing and let Ms. Moreau lead. There was no greeting and no signature. Liam read it twice at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and understood that whatever he had agreed to the night before, it had already been organized without him. The first event was a dinner at a private club in the West 50s, the kind of place that had no sign outside, and where the staff addressed every guest by name without being told. Nora met him at the door with a look that moved from his shoes to his collar in about 2 seconds, then handed him a slim card with a name printed on it, Liam Carter, guest of Ms. Moreau, and told him to keep his phone in his jacket pocket and not to take it out unless he stepped away from the table. He was also told to order whatever he wanted, because the point was to look comfortable, and nothing reads more visibly uncomfortable than a man who hesitates over a menu. He was not comfortable, but he ordered without hesitating, and Arya noticed. She sat across the table from a group of 4-2 investors and their partners, and she moved through the conversation with the ease of someone who had been doing this long enough that it no longer required any visible effort. She asked Liam questions in front of the others, not to check on him, but to draw him into the frame. Liam was just saying earlier, she would begin and then shape the sentence, so that whatever he had to do was agree or expand, never explain himself from scratch. It was a kind of management precise, almost architectural, and he found that if he stopped trying to understand the full structure and just responded honestly, he held up better than he expected. But the weight of the room was real, and it did not lift over the following days. The second event was a cocktail reception tied to a real estate development announcement, and the third was a breakfast meeting that somehow required formal attire. At each one, Liam felt the particular friction of being watched by people who were trying to determine what category he belonged to. He was not rich enough to be a peer, and not invisible enough to be staff. He existed in a gap that made certain people visibly uneasy, which meant they directed that unease at him in the form of questions designed to locate him on a hierarchy. Where did he go to school? What did he do before this? Whether he had any interest in investing. The questions were never hostile outright. They were too well dressed for that. But the intent behind each one was the same, to find the ceiling above him and measure how low it was. Liam answered without embarrassment and without elaboration. He had learned early that the worst thing he could do in these rooms was to perform a version of himself that didn't fit. So he did not pretend to have money he didn't have, and he did not apologize for what he was. What he did instead was listen carefully, answer directly, and ask follow-up questions that showed he had actually processed what was said to him. It was not charming in the way these circles usually rewarded, but it was consistent, and consistency in an environment built on performance tends to register as something. Arya registered it. He wasn't sure when exactly, but he began to notice the shift in the way she positioned him at events less off to the side and more directly adjacent, close enough that the geography itself communicated something to anyone watching. The Chicago conference arrived at the end of the second week. It was a 2-day event hosted by a private equity firm, and the guest list was the kind that got referenced in financial publications without specifics. Arya had been invited to speak on a panel, and Derek Holt was going to be in the room. Nora had mentioned his name once briefly, in a tone that contained everything she chose not to say. Derek Holt ran a rival fund, had a history with Arya that went back further than Moreau Capital, and had spent the better part of the last year positioning himself as the more stable, more serious alternative to whatever Arya represented. He was the kind of man who smiled with all of his teeth and said the exact right thing, and somehow left every room slightly smaller than he had found it. Liam did not have a specific instruction for how to handle him. The document Nora had sent covered a lot of scenarios, but not this one. The panel discussion went smoothly. Arya spoke with the controlled precision she always carried into professional spaces, and the audience responded with the muted attention of people who were used to being impressed. It was afterward during the reception that things shifted. Liam was standing near the far end of the bar when he heard Derek Holt's voice easy, carrying arranged for an audience telling a story to a small group that circled back in its final turn to Moreau Capital's most recent fund closure. The story did not attack Arya directly. It was more careful than that. It reframed her success as circumstantial her positioning, as lucky her instincts, as good timing rather than strategy. The people listening laughed in the polite way people laugh when they're not sure if they're supposed to, and Derek smiled and let it land. Arya was 20 feet away in conversation with someone else. She had heard it. Liam could tell from the small tension across her shoulders that she had heard every word, and that she had already made the calculation that responding was beneath her. Liam put his drink down on the bar. He walked over to the group with the specific casualness of someone who had just arrived rather than redirected, and he waited for a natural break in the conversation before he spoke. He said that he had actually been looking at the timeline of Moreau Capital's last 3 fund cycles, and that the closure Derek was referencing had landed during a market window that most funds had either missed or avoided entirely, which suggested a level of forward positioning that was harder to attribute to luck than to very deliberate analysis. He said it without aggression and without looking at Derek. He just said it like a fact he had found interesting and let the group decide what to do with it. Derek Holt smiled. "And you are Liam Carter," Liam said. He did not add anything else. The group shifted. The conversation moved. Derek smiled for the remainder of the evening, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the muscles around the eyes, and he did not approach Arya again that night. In the elevator back to their floor of the hotel, Aria stood beside him without speaking for a long moment. Then she said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Liam said. "The fund closure data, where did you get that?" "I read the document Nora sent me. It had a footnote with a public filing reference. I looked it up." Aria looked at him the way she had looked at him that first night in the penthouse, that same recalibrating attention, as though she was revising an estimate upward. She did not thank him. But when the elevator doors opened, she said, "The breakfast session tomorrow starts at 8. I'd like you there early." And the word "like" was not a word she used carelessly. Things were different after Chicago. Not loudly different. Nothing in Aria's world changed loudly, but the arrangement between them had moved. The careful formality that had structured their first 2 weeks began to thin in places, and what replaced it wasn't warmth exactly, but something more direct. She asked his opinion on things, not major decisions, not anything that touched the actual machinery of her business, but adjacent things, whether a particular event was worth the exposure it required, how a specific person had come across in a meeting, what he thought about an approach she was considering for a press interview. She asked, and she actually listened to the answer, which was more than most people in her position did. Liam was not naive about what this meant or didn't mean. The contract was still the contract. The money was still the reason. But the line between the arrangement and something more honest had begun to blur at the edges, and he was aware enough of that to know he should be careful about which side of it he stood on. He wasn't careful enough. The problem came from outside, as these problems usually do. A financial journalist named Marcus Webb had been circling Moreau Capital for months, looking for an angle on Aria that went beyond the professional. He had found Liam not through any particular intelligence, just through the ordinary visibility of being seen beside Aria in enough public photographs. Webb started asking questions of people who knew people who had been at the events Liam had attended, and those questions worked their way back to Liam through sources he hadn't known were connected. By the time Nora flagged the situation, Webb had already put together enough of the picture to make it inconvenient. But Marcus Webb was not the real threat. He was just the instrument. It became clear over the following week that someone had been feeding Webb information, specific details about the structure of Liam's arrangement with Aria. Information that wasn't public and couldn't have been assembled from photographs and social circles alone. Someone with access had made a decision to use Liam as the point of entry, because Liam was the newest and least protected element in Aria's orbit. Pull on him hard enough, and the story around Aria unravels from the personal outward, which is always the more damaging direction. Liam learned the full scope of this on a Tuesday evening when Nora called him into a meeting at Moreau Capital's offices, a space he had never been inside before, which told him something about the seriousness of the situation before anyone said a word. Aria was already there, seated at the end of a long conference table, and her expression was the expression of someone who has made a decision and is now in the business of implementing it rather than discussing it. She told him that the arrangement needed to be restructured. The upcoming gallery opening and the final conference on the schedule would proceed, but with increased distance between them in terms of visibility. She was also going to release a brief statement through her communications team that characterized their connection as professional rather than personal, which was accurate on its face, but would effectively neutralize the story Webb was building. She said all of this in the level factual tone she used for operational decisions, and at no point did she ask him what he thought. Liam listened to the whole thing. Then he said, "Who gave Webb the information about the contract?" Aria looked at him without shifting her expression. "That's being handled." "That's not an answer," he said. "It's the answer you're getting tonight." He understood in that moment what the last 3 weeks had actually been. Not a mistake on her part. Aria Moreau did not make mistakes she hadn't already accounted for, but a calculation that had developed a complication, and the complication was now being managed the same way she managed everything else efficiently, without sentiment, with the minimum disclosure required. He had been useful. He had performed beyond what was expected. And now the geometry of the situation had shifted, and she was adjusting accordingly. He also understood that the thing that had started to feel real between them had not registered for her the same way it had for him. Or if it had, she had already decided that it didn't change the math. He stood up from the conference table. He said, "I'll be at the gallery opening. After that, we can consider the arrangement complete." He said it without heat because he was tired, and because heat would have given her something to respond to, and he did not want to give her anything more right now. Nora looked at the table. Arya looked at him with that unreadable attention, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a beat that could have been imagined, something moved across her face that was not operational. Then it was gone. "The car will pick you up at 7 on Friday," she said. Liam walked out of the office and into the elevator and down into the cold of a November street. And he stood there for a moment, with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at nothing in particular, understanding that the version of this situation he had been quietly building inside his own head was not the version that had actually been happening. He was not a partner. He was not a confidant. He might not even be a person to her, in the way that word usually means. He might have just been a very well-compensated distraction. The car arrived at 7 on Friday exactly as promised. Liam was ready 10 minutes before that, standing near the window of his apartment in the jacket Nora had selected for the Chicago conference, which was the best thing he owned, that fit the occasion. He had spent the days between the conference room and tonight in the particular kind of quiet that follows a decision that hasn't fully landed yet. He had told himself he was attending the gallery opening because it was the last item on the schedule, because walking out early would have been dramatic, and because he was not a dramatic person. All of that was true. What was also true was that he hadn't been able to stop thinking about the fraction of a beat he had seen move across Arya's face before she closed it down again, that barely there thing that didn't belong to the operational version of her. He had not been able to decide if he had imagined it. The gallery was in Chelsea, a converted industrial space that someone had filled with large-scale photography and the kind of lighting that makes everything look more significant than it is. The guest list was smaller than the Chicago conference, tighter, more deliberate. Nora met him at the entrance, with a look that was slightly more careful than usual, which told him the evening had already developed some texture before he arrived. "Webb is here," Nora said quietly, as they moved through the entrance corridor. "He wasn't on the list. Someone brought him as a +1. Liam absorbed this without breaking stride. Does Arya know? She knows. She's already decided to ignore it. Nora's tone carried the particular flatness of someone who disagrees with a decision, but has accepted it as final. Her statement went out this afternoon through the communications team. Professional connection, no further comment. Officially, there's nothing for him to write. And unofficially, Nora looked at him. That depends on tonight. He found Arya near the center of the main room, standing in front of a large photograph, a city shot all vertical lines and gray light with a glass of sparkling water in her hand. She was in conversation with a collector whose name Liam recognized from one of the event briefs Nora had sent early in the month. She registered Liam's arrival with a single glance that communicated both acknowledgement and instruction. Stay close, say nothing yet. He stayed close. He said nothing. Marcus Webb was positioned near the back wall with a woman Liam didn't recognize, and he was doing the thing journalists do at events, where they're not supposed to be moving in a slow, apparently casual circuit that was actually quite deliberate, collecting proximity to people without triggering the social alarm that direct approach would set off. He had not spoken to Arya. He had not spoken to Liam. He was waiting for something, and Liam spent 20 minutes reading the room before he understood what it was. Derek Holt was also there. He was at the far end of the room near the bar in conversation with two people Liam didn't recognize, and he was positioned with a clear sightline to both Arya and to Marcus Webb. He had not acknowledged Liam's presence, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The geometry of the room, Webb waiting. Holt watching Arya holding her position was not accidental. Someone had arranged this, and the arrangement had a logic. Webb would approach Arya at some point during the evening, when the room was dense enough to make a scene inconvenient, and whatever she said or didn't say would become the quote that anchored the story. And whoever had pointed Webb at this evening, at this guest list, at this specific window, had done so knowing exactly how Arya would respond to a direct confrontation in a public space. She would close down. She would give Webb nothing he could use but the image of Arya Moreau refusing to comment, while her personal arrangement stood 2 feet away would be enough. The story didn't need a quote. It just needed a photograph. Liam understood this the way he had understood the fund closure data in Chicago, not because he had been briefed on it, but because he had been paying attention for 4 weeks to how this world operated and where its pressure points were. He crossed the room toward Derek Holt. He did not move quickly. He moved the way he had learned to move in these spaces, with the unhurried confidence of someone who belongs, and he arrived at the edge of Derek's conversation with the timing of someone who had simply found a natural moment. Derek looked at him with a smile that was already prepared. "Liam Carter," Derek said. "Enjoying the exhibition?" "Not particularly," Liam said. He kept his voice level and his expression easy. "But I think you already know I'm not here for the photography." One of the 2 people in the conversation quietly found somewhere else to be. The other followed a second later, with the instinct of people who recognize a private exchange forming. Derek's smile stayed in place. "You have something on your mind." "Webb's +1 tonight is a woman named Sandra Reeves," Liam said. "She works in investor relations at a firm that competes with 3 of Arya's current limited partners. That's not a coincidence, and you know it isn't because you're the one who made sure she was on the invite list." He watched Derek's expression for movement and found just enough of it to confirm he was in the right place. The story Webb is building doesn't hurt Arya on its own, but if it gets timed right alongside a whisper campaign inside her LP base, it becomes a structural problem. You needed someone on the inside to feed Webb the details of her arrangement with me, someone who had access early enough to know what the arrangement actually was. Derek set his drink down on the bar with the unhurried calm of a man who has been in uncomfortable conversations before and knows how to manage them. "That's an interesting theory." "It's not a theory," Liam said. "Nora's document had a distribution timestamp. The only people who received it before the first event were Arya's core staff, and 1 external compliance contact your firm shares with Moreau Capital on a joint filing they co-signed 14 months ago. You had a pathway. You used it." He said it without anger, because anger would have made it a fight, and a fight was something Derek knew how to handle. What he said it as was a fact, clean documented, finished. "I don't know what your history with Arya is, and I don't need to, but this is over tonight. You're going to let Webb leave without the angle he came for, and you're going to do that, because if this goes any further, the compliance pathway becomes a discoverable detail in a context that is much worse for you than it is for her." Derek Holt looked at him for a long moment. The smile had not disappeared exactly, but it had changed its nature entirely. It was the smile of a man recalculating, not a man who was comfortable. He picked up his drink again and said, "You're more interesting than I expected." "I know," Liam said, and walked away. He found a quiet corner near one of the side installations and stood there long enough to let his pulse return to something normal. He watched Derek cross the room a few minutes later, lean briefly toward Marcus Webb, and say something that made Webb look in Liam's direction once, and then look away. Shortly after Webb and Sandra Reeves left the gallery, there was no photograph, there was no scene. Arya appeared beside him about 15 minutes later. She did not ask him what had happened with Derek, which meant she had either seen some part of it or been told. She stood with him for a moment in front of a photograph neither of them was actually looking at, and when she spoke, Her voice was different from the voice she used in meetings, not softer, exactly, but less constructed. "How did you know it was him?" she asked. "The document Nora sent had a distribution list in the metadata," Liam said. "I noticed it in Chicago when I went back to look up the fund filing. I didn't know what to do with it until tonight." Arya was quiet for a moment. "You've been carrying that since Chicago. I wasn't sure it meant what I thought it meant. But you were sure enough tonight." "I was sure enough that doing nothing was worse than being wrong," he said. She turned to look at him, then fully the way she rarely did in public without the managed awareness of being observed. Whatever operational layer she usually kept in place in these rooms was not there right now, and without it, she looked closer to her actual age and considerably less impenetrable. "I made a decision in that conference room that I didn't explain to you," she said. "The statement, the restructuring, I did it without asking what you thought, and I told myself that was appropriate given the nature of the arrangement." She looked back at the photograph. It wasn't appropriate. It was just easier than the alternative. "What was the alternative?" Liam asked. "Admitting that the arrangement had become something I hadn't planned for and didn't have a clean protocol for managing." She said it the way she said most things, directly without decorative language, but the content of it was not something he had expected from her, and the honesty of it landed differently than her usual precision. "I don't do well with things I haven't planned for." "I know," Liam said. "I've noticed." Something close to a real smile appeared on her face. Brief, unguarded, gone quickly, but not so quickly that it hadn't been there. "The arrangement officially ends tonight," she said. "That was what we agreed." "It was," Liam said. "So what happens now is not the arrangement," she said. "Whatever it is, it would be something different, with different terms. Ones that would have to be discussed rather than documented by Nora at 6:47 in the morning." He looked at her. "Are you asking me something?" "I'm observing that there is a question available to be asked," she said, "and that I am for once not going to be the one who structures it." Liam understood that for a woman who structured everything, this was not a small thing. "Then here's what I think," he said. "I think we have dinner. Not an event, not a function. Just dinner somewhere without a guest list. And we find out what we actually are when there's no contract involved and nobody watching." Arya looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I know a place. No sign outside. Staff won't tell anyone you were there." The corner of her mouth moved. "You'll need to make a reservation. They don't take walk-ins." "I can handle a reservation," Liam said. He had walked into her world 4 weeks ago with a service tray and an accidental word carrying debt he couldn't name, and a future that looked like more of the same. He was walking out of it tonight as someone different, not because she had changed him, but because the pressure of the last month had clarified something in him that had always been there and had simply never been tested at this level. He knew what he was worth now. Not in the currency of this room, not in the terms of any arrangement, but in the way that matters more than any of that, the kind you carry in your own chest and don't need anyone to confirm. Arya Moreau was not a woman who trusted easily, and she was not a woman who let go of control without a fight she usually won. But she was also, Liam had come to understand, a woman who recognized something real when it stood in front of her and refused to disappear, and who was against all her own instincts willing to try the thing that couldn't be planned. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough.